I painted a fairly simple fuchsia painting this week, and I used 2 different photos that I took as reference. So today I thought I'd show you how I painted one of the fuchsias, and I'll also talk a bit about how I worked out my composition and how I put my drawing onto my watercolour paper. A lot of people ask me how I get my drawing onto my watercolour paper, so I want to show you how I do that, and I also want to show you quickly how I get the drawing in the first place. For this painting I started with 2 photographs. I took both of the photos myself at the Botanic Gardens in Sydney a few years ago. I mentioned last week that I like to paint from photos where the subject is in the sun, so that I can put lots of contrast into my painting, and I can also include some of the cast shadows which help to add interest. So I was happy to use these photos as reference because I took them in the sun, and there's some lovely cast shadows on the flowers that I want to include on the painting. These 2 photos are fairly busy though, and I don't want to replicate the photo and paint all that detail. If I was to paint everything that is in the photos, I'd be painting it for a month, and I don't have the patience, nor do I have the time for that. And I want to create something new. I don't just want to copy my photos. So what I thought I'd do is I'd use these 2 fuchsias here from this photo, and I'd paint in a few of the leaves that are above them. I know it's a good rule of thumb to group things in odd numbers, so I knew that I needed another fuchsia so that I could have 3 of them instead of 2, but I didn't want to put another full fuchsia on there because it would take me too long to paint it, and it would end up making my tutorial too long. So I decided to use this little unopened bud from this photograph. The photos were taken at the same time, which meant the direction of the lighting is the same in each photo, so that made it easy for me to paint. Once I knew what parts of the photos I wanted to use, I had to work out how I was going to compose them. So I got a piece of paper and I did a few quick thumbnail sketches. When I say quick, I mean quick. This is a piece of printer paper, it's not special drawing paper or anything like that. I tried it in both portrait and landscape orientation, but I felt because the flowers dangled down that they'd be better in portrait orientation. I was happy with this composition down the bottom, so that's the one I settled with. Once I was happy with the composition, I started to draw them to the scale that I needed. And again, I used a piece of printer paper. This is A3 size printer paper. Because I'm not working on my watercolour paper, I can scrub out my mistakes and make any adjustments that I need to make. Then, once I got my drawing the way I wanted it, I got a piece of tracing paper and I traced over it so that I could get a cleaner drawing. If something wasn't in the right place, I could move it on the tracing paper. When I was happy with that, I scribbled over the back of the drawing with a 2B graphite pencil. Then I put the graphite side against my watercolour paper. I tape it into position and then I trace it on. Sometimes I might use a light box to trace on my drawing, or sometimes I might use sarrel paper. This is a fine art transfer paper that acts a bit like old-fashioned carbon paper that we used to use in receipt books. Sarrel paper though can be a bit messy and it'll sometimes leave marks on my paper. I don't have that problem when I scribble on the back with graphite, so that's the method that I use most often lately. Okay, so my drawing is on my paper and now I'm ready to paint. So I'll show you where I went from there. The first thing I did was put a wash of colour behind the fuchsias. I used the same colours that I'll use on the fuchsias themselves. I've already started to paint the first one, so I'll show you what I did here with this second one. I'm wetting the top half of the flower with some water because I want to work on wet paper. That will give me soft paint edges and it will allow me to leave a little white highlight surrounded by soft paint edges. While that's wet, I get some permanent rose and I start to paint that on. This is one of the colours that I used in that soft pale splash behind the flowers. Because there's water on the paper, the paint moves and bleeds and I get all those lovely soft paint edges. At the top here, there is a white highlight and I want to try and reserve that if I can. So I keep going, still working on the wet paper. If I want it to be darker anywhere, I use more pigment, less water. I'll leave that to dry and I'll start painting in these other areas. Here I can work on the dry paper because there's no white highlights that I have to paint around and there's no soft edges that I need to try and leave. Then I can re-wet this top section with some water. And now I've got some Scarlet Lake. And I want to run that down the left-hand side and have it bleed back onto the pink. I'll also put that colour on this section and that will allow me to leave an edge. If I don't take the paint all the way to the top, that gives that section of the petal an edge, as though we're looking underneath it. This part of the flower here has that beautiful cast shadow on it, so I paint it to begin with as though the shadow isn't there. I look for the lightest colour that I see and that's what I start to paint. I've wet that section with water because I want to put another colour on here, not just the permanent rose, and I want the two colours to melt into one another. That's permanent rose. Now I'm going to get some Windsor violet and I'll put it on the bottom section of this part. Because I've got water on the paper, that helps to make those colours melt into one another. So I'm ignoring that cast shadow that's there. Once this is dry, I'll come back and I'll put another layer over the darker section of that part of the flower. Over here on this part, I can paint another layer of permanent rose on the dry paper that darkens it slightly, and I can leave a little lighter edge, which creates an edge on the petal. It makes it look a bit more 3D. I do the same thing on this one. That goes onto the dry paper and I leave that edge at the front. I'm going to drop some Scarlet Lake onto that permanent rose while it's wet. And those two colours will bleed together as well. Makes it look a bit more interesting. I've just painted some permanent rose on that section of the petal. Now I've got Windsor violet and I'm doing the same thing that I did before. Paper's wet and those two colours blend together nicely. I can see that the permanent rose up the top's not going to be dark enough, so I can drop some more pigment in there while it's wet to darken it. So that's permanent rose as well, it's just that it's darker. I've just done the same thing on the other side of the flower, and now I want to paint in that cast shadow that's on this section. So I've just wet where the cast shadow will sit with some water, and I'm going to repeat the process. Permanent rose at the top, and Windsor violet down the bottom. And that gives me that little sunlit spot on the front of the petal. Up the top here, I've washed in the leaves with some Windsor lemon and also the stem of the flower. Now I'm painting some sap green over the top of the Windsor lemon. The Windsor lemon will give the sap green a bit of a glow from underneath. It'll brighten it up slightly. So I'm painting the sap green here on dry paper. I used paint mixed with water for that. Now I want darker colour, so I'll wipe my brush over the pigment. My brush is wet and I just take it and rub it over the pigment, and that gives me this darker colour that I can paint down the left-hand side. I do that while that first layer of paint is damp, and that allows the dark green and the lighter green to blend together softly. If I think it's not going to be dark enough, I do it a second time. I get a bit more pigment and I put some more on there. Right down the bottom here, I've got a bit of Scarlet Lake. So I did the same sort of thing with the leaves. You can see I've washed them in with Windsor lemon first. And when the Windsor lemon dried, I came back over the top with some sap green. I didn't bother mixing up my green for this sap green. I thought would be okay. I didn't want to fuss with the leaves too much. I wanted to do them as simply as I could. To get the vein on the middle of the leaves, all I did was leave a small gap of the Windsor lemon underwash showing down the centre. And to add interest, to brighten them up and to create a bit of texture, I dropped some Windsor lemon onto the green while it was drying. When I finished my leaves, I went back to my flowers and had another look at them, and I adjusted some of the colour values. So here I'm painting a bit of water on, and I want to darken down this left-hand side of this flower. So I'll get some more permanent rose and I'll give it another layer just down this left-hand side. Just needed to boost the colour. It looks okay when it's wet most of the time, but after it's dried, it dries a bit lighter. So I just make adjustments like that to make sure it's the way I want it to look. And then I put a bit more colour on this other side as well. I'll let the colour bleed. So that's just a bit more paint now. Once I've got the paint on the paper, then I can wash my brush out and use it to move the paint where I want it. Over here I feel the same thing, that the paint has dried a bit too light. So I wet it with water and then I give it a second layer or a third layer now. That's a bit more Scarlet Lake. So when it's finished, I take off the washi tape that's around the edge. That gives me that white border. And then I cut away the gummed tape. And there's my finished painting. This painting will be a full-length voiceover tutorial on my Patreon site, hopefully next month when I get it finished. I hope some of that was of interest to you. Thank you for watching. Please give this video a like if you found it useful, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, because I post new watercolour videos like this one every week. I'll see you soon. I painted a fairly simple fuchsia painting this week, and I used 2 different photos that I took as reference. So today I thought I'd show you how I painted one of the fuchsia. I painted a fairly simple fuchsia painting this week, and the subject is in the sun so that I can get lots of contrast into my painting, and I can also include some of those cast shadows onto my painting. I took them out in the sun so that I could get the cast shadows on them, and yeah. I know it's a good rule of thumb to group things in odd numbers. It's a good thing to group things in odd numbers. When I was happy with that, I scribbled over the back of the drawing with a 2B graphite. When I was happy with that, I scribbled over the back of the drawing with a 2B graphite pencil, and then I put the graphite. This painting will be a full-length voiced-over tutorial on my Patreon site, hopefully next month when I get it finished. I hope some of that was of interest to you. Thank you for watching. Let's wait for the car to go past. This painting will be a full-length voiced-over tutorial on my Patreon site, hopefully next month when I get it finished. And let's wait for the car to get back the other way. I must have forgot something. This video a like if you found it useful, and subscribe if you haven't already, because I post new